In the Shadow of the Valley by Maggot Moshpit. Chapter 5. Harimau slowly walked towards Garth's tent, not wanting to scare off the figure standing in front of it. The tent was one of the small ones, and the light from within was not enough to give away the identity of the person.
Can I help you?
The figure jumped and clasped her paws to her bosom, answering in a whispered voice.
Harimau! I was just...
Rita, what are you doing here?
Don't tell Father.
I may have to.
Please?
Fine. But you must leave. I have business with Garth.
She nodded and scurried off. Harimau threw open the tent and stepped inside. Garth was sleeping there, his light snores permeating the enclosed space. Quietly, Harimau cast his gaze over the few possessions Garth had. A dagger of canine make, his pouch of feline tender, and a cloak. He picked up the dagger and felt its weight, noting it was slightly heavier than his own. He opened the bag of catches with the tip of the knife and peered inside. Something caught his eye he had missed the first time. A small piece of parchment. Before he could snag it, Garth snorted and his breathing changed. Harimau quickly clasped his paws behind his back and turned to face Garth, his back to the money bag.
Garth, may I have a word?
Garth's eyes snapped open.
What? Could you repeat that? I wasn't fully awake.
May I have a word?
Garth pulled himself up and stumbled over to a small table. He poured himself some water from a jug.
Yes. What is it?
You mentioned walking by the walls at Frostblight. What were you doing?
Oh, I was in the process of escaping.
Really? You stole money but still have time to stop and eavesdrop on a conversation?
Garth kicked himself in his mind.
Well, I concealed the crime with a decoy bag, and figured, as long as I was escaping, I would collect some information.
Not good enough of a decoy, apparently. How did the felines catch up to you even when you had a lead on them?
Nice one, Garth. Dig yourself deeper, why don't you?
He thought, drinking down the water. Coughing, he placed his cup down.
I rested a while too long. They caught up to me.
Resting? From what? You're in shape. You shouldn't have to rest after a short walk from the fort.
Garth almost lost his cool, whirling on Harimau and growling.
Sir Harimau, I know you don't trust me, but I assure you my information is correct.
Harimau leaned back on the table, paws still clasped behind his back.
You haven't answered my question.
Garth put on an expression of embarrassment more than anger, but Harimau did not miss how forced it looked.
All right, I'll tell you. I was gloating.
Gloating?
Yes. I stopped on a rock and stood in full view as a show of defiance. And they saw me. It was a foolish thing, I know.
Ha! Indeed it was. Good night, Garth.
He almost knocked Garth over with a pat on the back as he left.
Yes. Good night, Captain.
Harimau opened the tent flap and walked out into the cool night air, strolling casually towards his private tent. He held up the parchment he snagged from the bag of catches and studied it. It was written in a feline language. Not a surprise, as it was stolen from them. Harimau still thought more information could be gleaned from its contents. He stuffed it into his pocket and yawned.
Tomorrow.
The morning came too soon for most of the soldiers, as the sun awoke them from their much-needed slumber. Ziff groggily kicked his brothers awake.
Come on, we might get the jump on them. They'll be more exhausted than us. Up!
Zip and Zick pulled themselves up, shaking the sleep from their heads.
Sleeping might not have been a good idea. They could have slipped away in the night.
Ziff snorted as he watched the soldiers wake, Tezar smacking some of the laziest with a whippy switch.
If they did, we'll find them in no condition to fight, either dead on their feet or asleep. If we tried to climb that mountain without light, it would have been a disaster.
All right, I get it!
Tezar approached the three and bowed.
Sirs, we are ready to climb.
Ziff narrowed his eyes.
No.
Zick and Zip looked at him.
You have a plan, brother. Yes, we'll send half of us around the mountain, and the rest will climb. They will be surrounded. Tezar, Zip, pick the best runners. Have them set up a skirmish line on the other side of the mountain.
Tezar and Zip nodded and walked towards the soldiers. Ziff turned towards the sheer cliff face, now shrouded in fog, and sighed.
I hate climbing.
Zick shrugged.
I don't mind.
Zip and Tezar marched double time with their 10 subordinates to the left as the rest began to climb. Tezar marched without much rhythm, and her face was etched with anger and determination. She tripped over a tree root, sprawling onto the ground.
Damn it! Curse this tree!
She swung with her sword and transformed the root into splinters, nearby soldiers turning to look. Zip looked down in concern.
Tezar, you will see fit to control your temper.
She sheathed her weapon and turned her head back to the path.
My apologies, sir.
Zip and Tezar marched alongside each other into the early morning mist.
It's your mate, isn't it?
She wiped her face.
Do you have a mate, sir?
Yes, and 2 kits.
Then you'll forgive me.
Of course.
They forged ahead in silence, keeping the other soldiers in sight to ensure they didn't get lost in the swirling mist. Marten was not dreaming, so it came as a shock to him when he suddenly awoke. From his perspective, his head had just hit the table, and then Arbalest was shaking him.
Marten, we've got to go. The felines will have started climbing after us by now, but we still have a lead.
Bronze was dragging himself towards the cave entrance, yawning. Marten stood and stretched, stiff from his unfit sleeping position. He followed the other 2 out of the cave, with one backwards glance at the homestead of the wise man. As they groped their way around the cliff face, Marten wondered if this venture was worth it. He had no clue who this pill was, though it seemed people came from far and wide just to see him. He sighed as they started their careful descent. From what he had seen and heard, Pill was either a genius, a fool, or both. The silent, misty cliff seemed to be the only thing in the world, tumbling pebbles making eerie echoes off the rocks, disappearing out of sight into the whiteness. Marten looked down and gulped. They might be miles off the ground, or a few feet from the bottom, and they would be none the wiser for it. Bronze hummed a tune, without a care in the world.
Say, Marten, can you sing?
Can I sing? I suppose so.
Arbalest stopped to rest a moment.
As long as it's not too depressing.
I only know sad songs. They make great lullabies for, kits.
Fine, go ahead.
All right. Here's one I wrote.
His voice slightly muffled due to the fact that his face was pressed against the rock, Marten sang out loudly.
All around us is madness, with the shades of our past, casting shadows of sadness, with light from the sun's not cast. We will walk for all eternity, till Jeffreysa grants clemency. Ne'er will we rest in the shade of the M.M.M trees.
Bronze sniffed.
Beautiful.
Arbalest was not impressed.
Simple melody. Confusing lyrics.
It was late. I had to come up with something Miri never heard before.
I think it was fine.
Arbalest looked down, but still nothing could be seen.
Less chatter, please. The song was fine, Marten, but I'm getting a really bad feeling.
Bronze slipped slightly on a moist rock, but recovered quickly.
Quit being paranoid.
Despite Bronze's comment, all 3 remained silent. The regent drank deeply from the flask, then handed it back to Redrick.
Maybe not that one. The one with less vinegar. You might like that.
Redrick fetched the appropriate flask and handed it to the regent, who quaffed it.
Ah, yes, that's more like it. What vintage?
5846. Larja calendar, sir.
Yes, have that wine presented to him upon our next meeting. We'll be planning the ambush then.
Redrick pretended to know nothing, as he always did.
Ambush, sir?
He said as he placed the flask back on the tray.
Yes, we will be moving all our troops to the Arden Forest.
We've made sure the canines end up there.
I'm sure it will be brilliant, Regent.
The Regent laughed and stood up, stepping behind a curtain to change into his uniform.
I'm sure you aren't, Redrick. Oh, it was, though, at the risk of sounding like a narcissist.
Redrick knew he was a narcissist, but neglected to mention it. The Regent continued.
We sent a spy to mislead the canines. It'll tell them there's an ambush at Arden.
Redrick was confused. He never did have any interest in tactics, strategy, or espionage.
Sir?
Oh, you'll see, Redrick, when I have Cole's head on a pike.
The Regent stepped out and returned to his chair. Redrick did not emote or move, though he wanted more than anything to spill the drink all over the Regent's head. Well, almost anything.
Redrick.
Yes, Regent?
Have you ever lied to me?
No, of course not, Regent. It would mean my death.
Zhou looked outside towards the sundial, the two shadows on its circular surface landing on either side of a large symbol. Noting the time, the Regent looked back at Redrick.
Indeed it would. Tell me something then, and be honest.
Yes, of course.
What do the slaves think of me?
The fact that the Regent asked him to be honest would not keep the Regent from killing Redrick if he did not like the response. Of course, if Redrick lied, some other slave would not, and they would both be killed.
They fear you and hate you.
The Regent's fears were solidified. Of course, he wasn't surprised. He just hoped fear was the only thing. Redrick's reluctance to meet his eyes told him something else.
Why do they hate me? Aside from the obvious.
The real point behind the question was not to seek the answer to it, but rather to gauge Redrick's reaction. It was rather strong. He closed his eyes and shook slightly, not out of fear, but out of something else.
Well, sir, you broke one of our laws. The worst law, in fact.
The Regent studied his face some more, then chuckled.
This I know. Begone.
Redrick scurried off. The Regent was troubled by all this. Perhaps he had overdone things in his show of power. He would have to be careful. If sympathies grew for Miri and her fellow slaves, he could have a rebellion on his paws. He smote the table.
Lar, this is the one time I will admit you are right.
He would have to repair his public figure somehow. He turned to the balcony and looked out over the barren, frozen landscape, an idea brewing in his head. Redrick shuffled down the hall, his mental state a confused muddle. Emotions he could scarcely interpret ran through his mind, hate, fear, and other unpleasant feelings. Redrick didn't have the benefit of a family or a great many friends to help him with his troubles, so he mostly dealt with them himself. Now, though, he needed a friend. He stepped through a door and looked into the darkness.
Miri?
Who's there? Redrick? Is that you?
Redrick stepped forward until his paw hit something.
Miri, why is it so dark in here?
I was napping.
In the back of his mind, Redrick found it odd that she was even allowed to nap, but dismissed the thought.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't be in here anyway.
No. I wanted to speak with you anyway.
There was a rustle and the sound of curtains being opened, a beam of sunlight revealing Miri and a small table. Redrick sat at the table and admired the streaks of light as they played off Miri's reddish fur. Miri sighed and looked at Redrick, sitting across from him.
I want to get out of here.
We all want to leave, Miri, but we can't.
Miri whined pitifully, and Redrick wished he could take back what he said.
I need to. I've got this...
She searched her head for what Marten had called it.
Complex? Where something in your life affects the way you act and think?
Redrick had no idea if that was the correct term, or even how it was pronounced, but it sounded real enough.
I don't know.
She rested her head on the table.
Redrick, you're a good friend. I can trust you to not tell anybody any of this, right?
I wouldn't dream of telling anyone your secrets.
She smiled weakly.
You,
Redrick patted her paw reassuringly.
Take your time.
She took a deep breath.
You know what happened?
Redrick nodded.
Yes, I do.
She buried her face in her paws.
I've always been taught that it was wrong, and I feel so ashamed.
Miri, it wasn't your fault. It was the Regent's. Please, don't blame yourself.
You're right, but I still...
She sniffed and sobbed slightly. Redrick felt one of those negative emotions flare up, and he pulled the chair around the table and reached out a paw. He placed it on her back in a gesture of support, but it startled Miri, and she sprang up.
Ah!
Redrick pulled his paw back.
Sorry.
She sat still for a moment, then relaxed.
Forgive me. Please, continue.
Redrick placed his paw on her back and patted her a few times.
I'm sorry this had to happen, Miri, but there's nothing we could do about it. We're trapped.
She looked at him with a furrowed brow, pushing her chair out of reach. Redrick kicked himself.
Look, Miri, I'm just being realistic. Now, there's a chance we might be liberated.
Miri sighed and buried her paws in her face again.
See? Complex.
Redrick did not know how he should respond.
Miri, let me tell you something about myself.
Okay.
When I was enslaved, I was taken along with my sister. We were always kept together for some reason I could not fathom. We were given as gifts to the Regent here. The Regent that came before Lar.
Redrick swallowed, even as his mouth dried up.
She did not like the cold. Neither did I. She was defiant, and the Regent punished her for it.
Punished?
Yes, in the worst way.
Miri's eyes widened.
Oh, Jafreza, have mercy.
Like you, she wanted to escape and be done with it. They caught her crawling through a window and threw her into the dungeon. She died there.
Miri sat, her ears folded, feeling like a fool.
I'm sorry.
Don't apologize for having hope. Just don't try anything rash.
If we cannot escape, what will we do? I need to find my father before he comes back here and gets himself killed.
If your father was that much of a fool, he would not have been able to attract a mate.
Miri laughed softly.
That is true.
Insects outside Miri's window began to chirp louder and louder, a clear indication that the afternoon was growing near. Redrick stood, realizing that despite not getting the chance to talk about himself, he felt much better.
I should be going. Pleasant dreams.
Miri stood up quickly.
Wait.
She leaned forward and kissed Redrick's cheek.
See you later.
Redrick nodded and went for the door, with one backwards glance at Miri as she redrew the curtains. He walked towards the kitchen, but stopped in the middle of the corridor, placing a single paw on his cheek. It was funny how much a single action could just melt most of his problems away. Harimau looked over the parchment he had strewn across his desk. Translating languages was more difficult than he thought, but he was the only one who was willing to do the task. The first word was definitely payment. Payment for what was the question? He dragged out another sheet and began etching more symbols. Looking over the book of feline symbols, he pieced the fourth word together. Rendered. A shock went through his body as he quickly searched for the feline symbols that meant for and services. Harimau stood and grabbed his sword.
Payment for services rendered.
Rushing from his desk, he quickly ran to Cole's sleeping tent, bursting inside.
Sir, I found a note inside the bag of stolen money. I don't think it was stolen, it was payment.
Cole rubbed sleep from his eyes and looked up at Harimau.
What do you mean?
Harimau waved the note.
Payment for services rendered.
So, he was paid. Let's go arrest him. That way we can be sure.
Cole scrambled up and dressed himself, grabbing his battle axe from a peg on the wall. Harimau looked around the tent.
Where's Rita?
I don't know. She was here last night. Maybe she left early this morning.
Or late last night,
Harimau thought. Harimau grabbed a couple soldiers along the way, and with 4 armed guards at their back, they arrived at Garth's tent. Garth lay awake in the warm blankets, the cold morning air tickling his nose. He awoke an hour prior, but was unable to leave his sleeping role. An arm snaked across his side and pulled him closer to the arm's owner. He sighed contently as a massive battle axe came slamming into the ground an inch from his face. He scrambled back and looked up at the grim faces of Harimau and Cole.
Hello?
Another figure poked its head from under the covers.
Father!
Pulling the blankets over her to conceal her naked body from the congregation, she stammered.
I can explain. It just happened. I'm sorry.
Be silent.
Cole grabbed Garth and held him aloft.
You're under arrest.
Arrest?
Tears began welling in Rita's eyes.
You're overreacting. I'm a grown woman. I can choose who.
Silence! This man is a criminal and a spy. He will be brought to justice quickly.
Garth laughed nervously.
You got it wrong, General.
Harimau held a piece of parchment in front of Garth.
What does it say?
Without thinking, Garth read the note.
Payment for,
You can read it, huh?
Yes, I can read it. I picked up the language.
Cole dealt him a blow to his stomach.
We caught a feline scoping out our camp. We interrogated him overnight and he told us about you. The game is up.
Garth's jaw dropped.
Wait, they want you to go to Arden. It was a setup. You have to attack Folg. It's the only way. You have to...
Cole smote him again and dropped him onto the ground, kneeling down and speaking in a low tone.
We didn't catch any feline. Nice going. If you think we're going to be fooled by you again, you're a bigger fool than I thought.
He stood.
Take him away.
Harimau and the soldiers led Garth away.
Hey, at least let me put on some clothes.
Spies don't get clothes. That's the rule around here.
Cole looked at Rita, who had tears streaming down her face.
I'm sorry you had to see that.
He swept out the door, leaving Rita in a cloud of confusion and anger. Frey hung up his apron and cracked his knuckles, worn out from the morning's duties. He unwrapped a small parcel that lay next to his workspace and devoured a bun that lay inside. It had insect meat baked right into it, and he sat for a moment enjoying its flavor. One of the blacksmiths, a fox, walked up and took a seat beside him.
Afternoon, Frey. How's your lunch?
Tasty, though I put too much yoghurt in the dough. How about you, Halen?
I don't have lunch. My ration's been cut.
Frey frowned.
Really? Why?
I no longer have a daughter to care for.
Oh. Troy.
He nodded.
Look, I'll cut to the chase. I'm planning something. Something the rest don't know about.
Frey grabbed his shoulders.
What? Are you insane?
Shh. Just listen. I'm going to assassinate the Regent. I know you want to see us succeed. And you can help me.
Frey looked around at the other blacksmiths, who were completely unaware of the scheme.
If it's a solid plan, I'll listen.
And if it's not?
Frey clasped Halen's paw.
I'll think of a better plan.
Halen smiled and reached into his pouch, pulling out a vial of powder.
I need you. You have the Regent's trust. I spent days harvesting enough wolf tongue to make this.
Powdered wolf tongue would kill very quickly, by bonding with the blood cells within the body and preventing them from carrying any oxygen. Frey took the flask.
I may have an opportunity to feed him this. If this works...
Hopefully, they'll bring law back.